Surrealism was a movement that began in the 1920s. Surrealists, through their writings and works, redefined artistic genius. It was believed that Renaissance artists who were considered artistic geniuses were touched by divine power. They had innate talents that only few were blessed with. During the 18th and 19th centuries, artistic genius was viewed as having achieved a level of emulation and intellectual knowledge. Romantic artists, like the Renaissance, also viewed artistic genius as being rare, something you were born with, but not touched by divine power. Romantic artists embraced originality. Surrealists shared the same views as the Romantic artist idea of artistic genius as being exceptional and original. What separates the Surrealist definition is that they believe that artistic genius resides in the subconscious. A genius for them was an artist who could access their subconscious, thus making their work truly original and authentic. Surrealist theory was grounded in Freudian psychology. Freudian psychology stated that personalities developed in early childhood, which was largely influenced by frustrated and repressed sexual desires. Freud focused more on men and believed that women were basically triggers for men's feelings of shame, inadequacy, and unfulfilled erotic impulses. Women, when painted by male surrealists, often were presented as objects of desire or fear. Surrealism began as a literary movement, then expanded into the visual arts. It wasn't until after the Dada movement in Paris had ended did Surrealism start. In 1924, André Breton, who is considered to be one of the founders of Surrealism, wrote a manifesto of Surrealism. In it, he defined Surrealism as a psychic autonomous expression that lacks reason. Breton continued by saying that Surrealism is based on the superior reality found in dreams. At this point, Breton was more interested in defining Surrealism for literary purposes. He studied Freudian theories and was focused on dreams, the unconscious, and free association. From the very beginning, there were two types of Surrealist art. One type, biomorphic Surrealism, which was abstracted, contained work by artists Jean-Hans Arp, Max Ernst, Moreau, and André Masson. It was created through the practice of automatism. Automatism was allowing the creative process to happen automatically, without forethought or control of the mind. This type of process created imagery that was at times recognizable, but may have also contained elements of abstraction. Because they allowed their art to be created in an autonomous way, these surrealists, like Dadaists, embraced the element of chance. The second type of surrealist art was done by artists Salvador Dali, Yves Tanguy, and René Magritte. Their works were done in meticulous detail. The environments and objects were represented realistically, but they were often distorted and/or taken out of context and placed in fantastical scenes as if looking into one's dreams. Their artistic influence drew from Henri Rousseau, Chagall, and de Chirico, along with the Romantics of the 19th century. Both directions of Surrealism attempt to connect with the subconscious or other realms of reality. Communism was the political movement most associated with Surrealism. As these artists created their works, André Breton continued to write and publish periodicals. For 6 years, between 1927 to 1933, Breton joined the Communist Party and combined French Surrealist poetry with the politics of Karl Marx. In the 1930s, Picasso, who began to create surrealist work, also became a communist. You may remember that we looked at the work of Jean-Hans Arp, who was one of the original Zurich Dadaists. He made many collages with torn paper and then began biomorphic imagery by allowing his pencil to move unconsciously on the paper. He would then turn his drawings into constructed paintings. Arp continued his biomorphic constructed paintings, and his collages began to show similar imagery. Here we see his later work. It's a sculpture that was originally made of plaster, then years later cast in bronze. It is titled Head of Three Annoying Objects from 1930. As you can tell, this is a biomorphic piece. On the bottom mass sits three objects of a fly, a mandolin, and a mustache. These names came from a story that Arp wrote about when he woke up from a sleep to discover three annoying objects on his face. The main bottom mass represents the head. The three objects are laid on top and not connected, so the spectators can interact with the piece and move them around. This created another element of chance in his work. If you remember, Arp was the one who dropped torn pieces of paper on the ground and liked how they fell by chance and recreated that arrangement in his collages during the Dada stage. Arp named his pieces after his works were finished. That way, he would not be manipulated by the outcome or end result of his pieces. He did not want to have a preconceived idea of what his art should look like when he started new pieces of work. Max Ernst was a painter and sculptor. This is an oil on wood with wood construction, titled Two Children Are Threatened by a Nightingale. Let's look at the details of this. This is a dreamscape, and if we look here, there is an actual fence opening here, the gate, and that gate is bringing us, the viewer, into this painted scene. And there's a collapsed woman here, and then there's another young girl, and she's running away holding a knife in her hand, and just above her there's a bird flying just above her head. Then there's this orange house, and on top of the orange house is a man, and it looks like he's kidnapped a young child. Her head is here and her hair is waving back and her body's here. Here's the man's head, his back, and then there's one leg and there's another. And then if you look, his hand is reaching for the actual handle on the frame. This title is written in French on a wooden strip at the bottom of this painted scene right there. And this is a poem that Ernst had written about girls on the outskirts of town who were being tormented by a nightingale. Max Ernst began a new drawing technique he used, and it's called frottage, F-R-O-T-T-A-G-E, where he would place paper on top of a textured surface and would rub over it using a pencil. This painting, called The Horde, uses the frottage technique along with scraping techniques called goutage. Here we see tree-like horrific creatures that are an eerie premonition of what it would feel like to be in Europe during World War II. Ernst was viewed, as many artists were during this time, as a degenerate artist by the Nazis. During World War II, Max Ernst fled to New York City with the help of Peggy Guggenheim, to whom he married. The marriage lasted only a few short years. In New York, he met other Surrealist refugees along with Ernst, who would have a great impact on American art. This painting, called Europe After the Rain, is from 1940 to 1942. This is an apocalyptic view of the world after the war. The land is seen almost as an organic, rotting, cancerous growth. There's a soldier with a bird's head wearing a helmet and holding a spear, which is right here. And next to him is a woman. And they are both looking out over this barren, transformed land. There's also a female form inside this destroyed structure right there. And the meaning for this is unclear, but then again, in Surrealist work, nothing really has to make sense. Here's a detail of the woman and man bird, for lack of a better description. The woman's here, her back is towards us, and she's wearing a hat looking out into this barren landscape. And there's the man bird with the bird head and the spear that he's holding. They are both looking over the landscape, embedded with rotted carcasses and what appears to be a cancerous growth. It's important to note that Max Ernst fled from the Gestapo into a self-imposed exile, which may have influenced this painting. Even though surrealist work doesn't have to make sense, Ernst's experiences may be implying his disgust and sadness about the effects of war. Here's another painting by Max Ernst, made the same year in 1942, titled Surrealism in Painting. There's a smooth, large creature which is a biomorphic fusion of a man and bird. This creature is working on abstract painting. And here you can see it's almost like a human hand here, and then there's several birds' head connected to this one body. Ernst created many hybrid creatures for his paintings. However, he mostly identified with his bird creatures. The heads of this creature are not looking at the canvas as it paints, making it appear as if the creature is using an automatic process, meaning he's just letting the hand and brush move on their own without any forethought. Now we're going to move to Joan Moreau. Moreau once said that his imagination was, and I quote, always born in a state of imagination. This painting by Moreau was made in 1924-25 called Carnival of Harlequin. His work has been described as playful. Here we see a slightly muted beige room filled with odd little creatures. Some are floating around while others are interacting with each other. So if we look, we can see these two characters are kind of playing rope with each other of some sort. These two are just kind of floating around. And here's the top of a ladder. Here's the bottom. And we see this ladder going up where we see a detached ear and detached eye at the top of the ladder. Now, Moreau, like many artists, enjoyed giving life and personality to inanimate objects. They like to animate the inanimate. Now, here's an interesting body that's to the right of the ladder, and it's almost like a white string instrument with a long neck. And then here we see a round head that's half blue and half red with a thin mustache and even thinner pipe that he's smoking. And he has this queasy type of expression on his face. Now, there's so much going on with this, and there's so much imagery with the characters. And some of these characters are forms based in nature. Others may be inspired by medieval art or images created by other surrealists. And this is one of his more complex paintings. Now this painting is a much more simplified canvas titled Dog Barking at the Moon. Here we see a cute little odd dog barking at the moon that's just above its head. And on our left we see a ladder that appears to be going up into the darkness. Now ladders for Moreau symbolize transcendence. It was something that connected to another unearthly realm. This next piece is an assemblage by Moreau called Object. Here we see a round strip of wood with a long oval hole in the center. And hanging inside the center of this hole is a woman's leg wearing a high heel shoe. This type of erotic use of the female body is not uncommon in surrealism. And if we look up top, there's a parrot here that's perched on a branch and suspended by a small cork bowl. And the base of this piece is a bowler hat. And on the brim of the bowler hat, it's a nice black bowler hat. And on the brim is a little red fish that appears to be swimming. And then there's also a piece of paper that covers about half the sculpture from the bottom on the one side. Now, this paper really doesn't mean anything, okay? It has no specific meaning, and this piece has no specific meaning. It's meant to stir the imaginations of the viewers. He wanted to let the viewers try to create their own story or meaning through the objects. Now, World War II started in 1939 and ended in 1945. When World War II started, Moreau fled Paris and returned to his home in Normandy and Spain. At this time, Spain had a strong right-winged government. The years of war isolated Moreau, who began to read mystical literature and listened to classical music of Bach and Mozart. This painting from 1940 is one of a series of 23 small paintings titled Constellations. In this painting, you can see the lyrical aspects of his musical influence and his intricate attention to his work. Moreau had interest in flight and transformation. Moreau studied the constellations and galaxies, and he also was intrigued with the migrations of birds and hordes of butterflies. Moreau exhibited in New York and heavily influenced many young American painters. The work of André Masson is a bit different. This is a mixed media on canvas by Masson titled Battle of Fishes. Masson immigrated from Paris to New York. He had very passionate convictions. During World War I, Masson was severely injured and spent a long time in a hospital, but never fully recovered. His experiences of the war and his physical ailments left him to be an extremely angry person who was forced for a short time into a mental hospital. Masson was part of the Surrealist group, but at times would be disassociated from them due to his aggressive temper and fighting with other members of the group. Much of Masson's work reflected his belief that all living creatures were brutal, especially humans who were viewed by him as being sadistic. His work was created in an automatic manner. He would pour glue on the canvas, then throw sand on it and brush the loose sand away. By using this technique, he allowed chance to formulate his composition. However, he, unlike many of the Surrealists, believed his work should contain conscious, deliberate decision-making, as we can see both in this piece of work. Masson's automatic technique of pouring and throwing at his canvas is said to have been a large influence on Jackson Pollock's later works. There were a couple of Surrealist artists that would use Renaissance perspective with intense colors and highly finished surfaces to create illusions of their dreamlike images. Two such artists are Yves Tanguy and Salvador Dali. They wanted to represent the fears and desires that exist in the unconscious. Yves Tanguy was a self-taught artist. There was a naive manner to his early works. However, once he joined the Surrealist movement, his painting techniques greatly improved along with his fantastical imagery. In this painting, titled Mama, Papa is Wounded, he paints a land that extends into infinity. The space is empty except for the strange biomorphic shapes that linger in their own solitude. And you could see them in their own solitude here. There's one here, there's another there. This is a cast shadow. And then here we have another larger shape, but it's still isolated, along with these back here that are not interacting with each other. The sky is somewhat dark and threatening in the far distance. Arguably the most famous Surrealist artist is Salvador Dali. Dali created and lived Surrealism. He created himself in its image. Not only were his paintings, prints, sculptures, and writings surreal, but also his mannerisms, expressions, actions, and appearance, including his mustache. Dali made mad, fantastical, erotic, and irrational art fashionable. Salvador Dali, who we can see right here, was born in Barcelona. Much of Dali's work is placed in barren landscapes. He contributes his landscapes in his work to be the product of both his imagination and childhood. He was very knowledgeable of the several movements since Impressionism, particularly the metaphysical school. Dali studied the 18th century academic artists and 17th century artists like Vermeer. He was also influenced by the writings on dreams and the unconscious by Sigmund Freud. Salvador Dali was introduced to the Surrealists by his friend Moreau, and he soon moved to France to officially become a member of the group. And here we can see the entire members of the group here along with Moreau. Dali developed a highly detailed style, often using a miniaturist technique. He painted his objects in a detailed manner so they were identifiable and could exist in his work and make his dream worlds just as real to the viewer as a traditional landscape. In 1929, Salvador Dali created what we see here, the painting Accommodations of Desire, which was a small piece, a little over 8 by 13 inches. This is an oil and collage on panel. Dali used 2 illustrations of lions' heads that he cut out from a book and placed parts of them on painted forms that could be interpreted as stones. These forms cast shadows onto the landscape. So if we look, these are what appears to be stones on the landscape with the cast shadows. And then we have the cutouts of the lines right here. In the lower right corner, if you take notice, there's an army of ants, and ants occasionally appear in his works. This painting was made at the time Dali was dating Gala Iliwa, who was then married to the Surrealist writer Paul Iliwa. This painting was in response to and represents his intense sexual anxiety. His desires are represented by the terrorized lions' heads. We see one full head in the front, right over here, and then in the back we see a red silhouette. And just right of that is the mane of the lion's head, and then over here is the growling open mouth. Now, Dali painted more lions in the back, so you can see over here there's another lion here, and then back here is what we see as a self-portrait of Dali himself, possibly with his lover Gala, and then a line that's part of him or in front of him. This next painting is one of his most famous pieces, titled The Persistence of Memory from 1931. Again, this is a small painting, a bit over a foot long. And if you look just above me, right up there, there is an image of the original framed painting that hangs in a museum. It gives you a better idea of the size of the painting. Like Tangier's painting we recently looked at, the landscape is infinite. We see recognizable objects. The pocket watches are extremely larger than normal in relation to the other objects, and are painted as if they are fabric draping over a branch of a tree, such as this. And then we see one sliding off the edge of a brown platform. And then another one here, another watch, is pocket watch, is draped over a deflated head. The profile appears in several of his pieces. They look as though they are melting. Again, we see the army of ants. This time they are on the red pocket watch in the lower left corner. Dali came up with this idea after one of his dinner parties. When everyone had left, he sat and looked at the camembert cheese melting on the table. He later went to his studio and looked at his canvas that already had a landscape on it, and decided to recapture his memory of the cheese that metamorphosized and transformed from a hardened state to a softer state. He saw the connection of how matter transformed from one state to another throughout space and time. This next painting is Gala and the Angeles of Malay, immediately preceding the arrival of conic anamorphose. Here we see Gala smiling as if she's posing for a photograph, standing in the back of the yellow room, right back here. And then closer to the entrance, we see the back of Vladimir Lenin. On the wall above the door is a painting of Malay's Angeles. Dali interpreted this painting to be about predatory female sexuality. On the other side of the open door, in the darkness, is a monstrous figure representing Maxim Gorky, who is a Russian writer, right here. And he's peering out from the shadows wearing a feminine top and a lobster on his head. It's a very odd and nightmarish scene that gives us so many representational clues as to what the story may be, but it defies any logical sense. This next painting by Salvador Dali is titled Soft Construction with Boiled Beans, Premonitions of Civil War from 1936. This is a vicious representation of physical suffering and psychological torment. Here we see a gigantic figure with an anguished facial expression that is being torn apart, possibly by itself from below. There are other body parts along with beans scattered on the ground. This is certainly an expression about war, but he may not have been entirely against it. In 1934, he upset the Surrealists, and they had many arguments because Dali would not condemn Hitler. Dali briefly moved to the U.S., then later moved back to Spain with Gala, where he continued to create his work. Now, Magritte was quite the opposite of Salvador Dali. Magritte's personality was much more subtle and low-key. He was not nearly as popular and didn't have the immediate success and recognition as Dali did. However, Magritte's work eventually became recognized, especially with the pop artists of the later generations. This painting, titled The Treachery of Images, is of a briar pipe. It is a realistically rendered painting. Below the pipe are words stated, "This is not a pipe." This painting questions how words are related to imagery. Magritte here challenges the way images and the things they represent are fused together. This painting is called The Human Condition. At first glance, we see a window with curtains. As we continue to look, we see a painting on an easel in front of the window with curtains around it. And here we see that. So it looks right away just to be, we're looking out the window of a landscape, and then there's curtains. But as we look more closely, we could see the bottom of the easel, which tells us that there's a painting of the landscape right on there. And you can also tell that by the edge of the canvas and also the top of the easel. Now, this painting on the easel is of a peaceful landscape that would likely be the same scene we see from the window if the canvas was not there. The painted canvas, therefore, fills in the landscape that it's blocking. This painting gives the impression that the painting of the landscape is less real than the rest of the painting, especially the landscape that it's covering. But nothing in the painting is real because the entire image is a painting and therefore not real. This next image is by Hans Bellmer called Doll from 1935. Hans Bellmer was part of the second wave of Surrealism. He was originally from Poland, then moved to Berlin, where he studied drawing with George Gross. Hans Bellmer would arrange dolls and mannequin parts with other objects to create strange and disturbing constructions. These constructions were simply called dolls. The works were seen as both masochistic and erotic. Many dolls were of adolescent females that gave his work a sadistic aura. When Bellmer finished creating his constructions he worked on, he would then photograph them. Bellmer became well known for these photographs that he exhibited and published. Even though females were not viewed well in many Surrealist works, mostly created by men, there were women who proved their talent in Surrealist art. Marie Oppenheim became part of the Surrealist group and began exhibiting with them. She also modeled for many of Man Ray's photographs. Oppenheim was a prolific artist, creating poetry, sculpture, paintings, and drawings. She is most well known for this piece called Object from 1936. It's a fur-covered teacup, saucer, and spoon. It is referred to as a fur-lined teacup. The idea of this came about during a conversation she had with Picasso at a cafe over Oppenheim's designs for jewelry, which had fur-lined metal tubing. Picasso commented that just about anything could be covered in fur. When Oppenheim heard this, she quickly commented back, "Even this teacup and saucer." This object of the teacup and saucer is considered both erotic and repulsive, making it, when joined together, a fetish. This painting, titled Some Roses and Their Phantoms, was painted by American artist Dorothea Tanning. Tanning unfortunately was overshadowed by her husband Max Ernst. Her work is bizarre, as we can see here in this painting. Here we see abstracted and hybrid roses on a tablecloth and floating in the space behind the table. So here we see these abstracted roses here, and then one's floating here, and then another there. We also see a strange insect-like creature on top of the grid-shaped folds of the tablecloth, and that would be here. You could see the legs coming out. And peering up from the far side of the table is a monstrous creature, and you can see the creature's eye right there. Tanning once said, and I quote, "It is necessary to paint the lie so great that it becomes the truth." This next artist, Lenora Carrington, was a British-born writer and painter. She was only 20 years old when she developed a relationship with Max Ernst and moved to Paris. This was before Ernst married Dorothea Tanning. Carrington eventually settled in Mexico. Her imagery in this self-portrait, also called The White Horse Inn, is related to her childhood and Celtic mythology. She also continued these themes in her writings. Here we see her next to her friends who have magical powers. The hyena right here, and her other friend, the rocking horse, that is levitating beside her. Let me see if I can do that right. So here's the hyena, one of her friends, and then this other one, the levitating rocking horse, is another one of her friends. Carrington saw the white horse outside the window as a symbol of herself, right there. And what she wanted to represent in that is her being liberated and free. Followers of Freudian dream imagery can read into this, implying that this is a symbol of sexual desire. This artist here, Remedios Varo, for some reason is not in your text. Varo was part of the inner circle of the Surrealist group. Her work reflects her own psychological and physical journeys. She lived in Spain till she was forced to flee to Paris during the Spanish Civil War, then later forced to flee Paris from the Nazis. Varo and her husband, poet Benjamin Pérez, hid for a year in Marseilles before they were able to safely relocate in Mexico. There in Mexico, she became close friends with Leonora Carrington. She was also friends with Frida Kahlo and Diego Rivera. Her work is filled with science, magic, alchemy, and mysticism that creates fantastical imagery. In this painting, which is one of her later paintings titled Creation of the Birds, we see an artist-scientist representing wisdom in the form of an owl sitting at a desk. Wisdom is drawing a bird. There's a machine next to her distilling primary colors from the atmosphere. So here we see wisdom in the shape of an owl, and then the machine right here is creating primary colors for her to paint, and she's drawing birds on the table here on the paper. And if you look closely, you will see a moon in the upper right part of the left window. The moon is the domain of woman and owl. Here, moonlight is captured and magnified through the triangular-shaped lens. It illuminates a drawing which stimulates the birds to life that eventually take flight and fly out the window. So here's the moon over here, and it's going through this device, and here she is drawing, and the cord is going through this musical instrument into her heart. So she's drawing from her heart, and she's drawing these birds, and this device is giving life to what she's drawing, and they're flying out the window. The bird here embodies new life. This painting connects art, science, alchemy, and nature. They all support each other equally, which is represented by the two vases on the wall in the corner here. And what's happening here is there's gold going back and forth that continually feed each other. Vera was a master at creating fantastical, dreamlike, mystical worlds. Picasso was friends with and accepted by the Surrealist group. Although he was never a true Surrealist, Picasso did not try to represent anything dreamlike. Here in this painting is the seated bather. It is a monster that is part petrified woman and part skeleton. It appears to be casually sitting with praying mantis-like attributes. Since female praying mantises have been known to kill and eat the males after they mate, this painting ties in with the Freudian theory of women being threatening. Albert Giacometti was a sculptor who joined the Surrealist group in the 1920s. This piece is a bronze sculpture titled Woman with Her Throat Cut. It shows an abstracted representation of dismembered pieces of a female body. Giacometti insisted that this piece be displayed in the floor without a base. Like Modigliani's female nudes, Giacometti gives the viewpoint of looking down onto a woman, although Modigliani's pieces were not violent. This piece here exemplifies a sexual violence that preoccupied some of the minds of the Surrealists. This piece by Giacometti is called Invisible Object, Hands Holding the Void. It's one of his last surrealistic sculptures. We see an elongated female creature placed in a device that is pinning her in by a board down near her feet, right down here. And then if you look up at the top part of her body, with a sacred gesture, she holds an invisible object as if she is presenting it in a mysterious ritualistic ceremony. Henry Moore was a sculptor whose work was a fusion of figurative abstraction and surrealism. This piece, titled Reclining Figure from 1939, is carved out of elm wood. Here we see several holes that are punctured right through the female figure. However, it doesn't feel threatening or violent due to its many soft curves. The body is transformed into a sort of landscape where the holes are transformed into caves and tunnels. Now we're going to move into surrealistic photography. In the 1920s and 30s, Paris was a place where artists could explore and experiment with different mediums, such as photography. The surrealists liked the strange juxtaposition that photography could capture in everyday life. As visually stimulating as the images were, surrealists didn't fully accept many of the photographers into their group because they didn't hold the same personal theories and viewpoints. Many photographers were just experimenting with different techniques rather than truly trying to create something from their subconscious dreams. Eugene Adjate was one such photographer. Adjate single-mindedly captured images of Paris. He spent over 30 years photographing all aspects of France itself and French life. This image is called Magasin Avenue des Gobelins from 1925. It's a photo of a clothing store's front window where the dummies are placed facing different directions wearing nice suits. The reflection of the city makes it appear as if the dummies live in this reflected other world. And we could see that right here. You could see the buildings in the background and the faces and bodies of these mannequins, or it could be other beings. The surrealists really appreciated how this found image dislocates time and space. It creates a strange and different reality. We have already looked at the early works of Man Ray during his Dada period. Ray eventually found himself part of the Surrealist group. We looked at one of his constructive pieces, but he also created sculptures, paintings, drawings. He worked on film and photography. He regularly submitted his photographs to Surrealist journals and Surrealist books. This photo, called Fingers, was developed and processed in a way that solarized the image, meaning that it produced a reversal of tones around the form's edges that made average images such as fingers look otherworldly. Man Ray took fashion and portrait photographs. In this image called Observatory Time, The Lovers from 1936, we see a model laying with her arm raised to the sky that hosts a set of large female lips. The model is wearing a stylish polka-dotted beach robe that helps to make this a high fashion and erotic hallucinatory scene. Now this image by Andre Cortez, called Distortion Number 4, is a fascinating image. Here the artist creates a fun house effect that was simply referred to as distortions. This nude female stands in front of a special mirror, giving the impression that the figure on our left is transformed into a monstrous beast. And if you look at her feet, you can see how they merge down here, this figure, their feet just kind of merge into the other feet of this monstrous beast. And we can see all the strange distortions of the body. It almost appears also this monstrous figure with its distorted long head is looking directly at us, the viewer. It is a strange and interesting piece. This last image is by Bill Brandt, titled Portrait of a Young Girl, Eaton Place, London. Brandt worked in a studio of Man Ray. He was interested in optical distortion that he referred to as, I quote, something beyond reality. Brandt used a specific camera that would distort perspective. Here we see a dreamlike effect being created through the high contrast. The far back walls of the room disappear into darkness, giving a close, personal view of the young girl, and makes us feel that she is in the dream and the city is a distant reality. Surrealism was profound in how it altered basic perception of imagery and therefore changed the world of art. Surrealism fully spread to full acceptance in the United States after World War II and eventually influenced many American contemporary artists.